Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Mullins for Reclaim Democracy, and I'm here tonight to conduct an interview on a topic that's very important to all of our lives, and that topic is corporate personhood. I'm joined in this conversation by Richard Grossman, who is a co-founding member of the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you.
And by Tom Lindsay, who's an attorney and co-founding member of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks for having us, Jim.
Sure. I'd like to start by giving a little bit of history to explain some of the origins of how we've come to where we are on this topic of corporate personhood. In 1886, in the case of the County of Santa Barbara versus Southern Pacific Railway Company, the Supreme Court declared that the human right of equal protection under the law applied to corporations as well. And that's been the law of the land ever since. So my first question to you, Richard, is what has been the lasting effect of that decision?
Well, we have to look at that decision in the context of other decisions and other processes that have been going on in this country since it was founded. And it's in the tradition of a relatively small number of people making the rules and making the rules for making the rules that enable them to dominate the large number of people. So by the time the large corporations were being formed after the Civil War and the robber barons were doing their work, they felt that they needed even more mechanisms to wield the law against the majority of people. And, you know, it's without going into the long history, they look back, the men running the giant corporations of the time in the 1880s, the railroad companies, the bank companies, the land companies, the insurance companies, and they looked back into American history and saw that at the beginning you had a relatively small number of white men who had wrapped themselves in the Constitution in order to deny the rights of African Americans, indentured servants, women, Native people, and most of the bipeds, 80% of the bipeds that were living in North America. And so their plan was to wrap their institution, their governing institution. The corporation is a governing institution as well as a wealth concentrating institution. And so they sought to have the government, the government officials, the relevant government officials, wrap their corporations, their business corporations, in the Constitution. And this case was one of a number of cases that accomplished that along the way. And so what we have today is that a relatively small number of people who run the corporations today are wrapped in the Constitution, and they're able to wield the law against the rest of us.
Plus, getting back to this Santa Clara case, in essence, if you have a small number of people running the majority, which is in essence what we have today, the few governing the majority, you wouldn't expect just one court case to pop out of nowhere and for the Supreme Court justice to all of a sudden say, hey, corporations are persons. And although there's been a lot of focus on the Santa Clara case over the past couple of years as people have tried to grapple with the issues of corporate rights and what that means and how corporations have greater rights than people and communities, that when you look back at the Santa Clara case, in essence 20 years before Santa Clara, and it was decided in 1886, you had 20 years of lower court decisions that said, well, of course, silly people, corporations are persons under the law for purposes of constitutional rights. And so driving themselves into the Constitution, what Richard talks about is the few with the major corporations emerging after the Civil War, then used the best lawyers and the best law firms in the country to drive themselves, to shield themselves and clothe themselves in the Constitution. And so Santa Clara was really just a codification of gains made during those 20 years. But there have been 67 Supreme Court decisions over the past 150 years validating and vindicating the Santa Clara concept. So to think about Santa Clara in some ways as a mistake, which unfortunately has emerged in some literature around this issue, is really a mistake of its own because it is part and parcel of the socioeconomic framework of this country that corporations are clothed and have driven themselves into the Constitution to claim those rights.
And it's also, I mean, they were not only driving themselves into the Constitution, but driving themselves into the culture, so that it's not just the Supreme Court and the law of the land that says the corporation has all these powers and rights. The culture itself, we live in a corporate culture. And so the culture itself is constantly reinforcing that. In addition, from the beginning in this country and going back, to the beginning of time, there's always been a struggle over who is a person. I mean, who has rights before the law in whatever state or country that they're in. And so, just to take a quick slice at it, we see that at the time of the writing of the Constitution, 80% of the human beings living in the 13 states were defined as non-persons and not having rights. So there has been a struggle of the denied to become persons. And then when, in fact, after the Civil War, when this new group of robber barons of the corporate class were trying to perfect their corporation as a governing institution, it's very logical that they would, draw upon the past history and say, well, we're going to make our entity, this sort of imaginary thing called the corporation, we're going to make it operate like a person and give it all the powers that persons under the law have always had. So, it's, as Tom says, it's so much more than this one case or two cases or four cases.
You've gone so far as to say that when corporations rule, democracy goes out the door. And so what do you mean by that? It sounds like this is a very profound change in society, or since it's been going on for so long, do we actually have a democracy?
Well, I don't think we've ever had a democracy. I mean, again, if when the Constitution was written and ratified, 80% of the people here had no rights and were not part of the body politic, and therefore had no say, there was no consent of the governed, they had no rights. We weren't a democracy at that time. And what we have is the wonderful language in the Declaration of Independence and some language in the Constitution that sort of sets up the rules. I mean, it's creating guaranteeing to all the people in all the states a Republican government. And what's involved in all of that is the slew of things that we learned in grade school. Of people have inalienable rights, that we are sovereign, that with the American Revolution, sovereignty passed not from the king to the state governments or to the U.S. government, but to the people. And our rights existed before government, and we create a government in order to protect those rights, in order to vindicate those rights. And from the beginning, we've had a government, in fact, that enabled a few people, initially the white slave owners, merchants of the North, to deny the rights of most of the people and to make the rules for making the rules. After the Civil War, when we moved from a slave state to what was becoming a corporate state, you had the corporate class joining with the ex-slave master class to come together and create these giant corporations as governing institutions. And once they wrapped themselves in the Constitution, they were able to use the law to deny, again, the rights of most people. And it comes down, and we, so much of it is still, it's like the long arm of 100 years ago or 200 years ago still applies. But one very simple example is when you go to work for a corporation, as soon as you cross the property line, you have no constitutional rights. You have no freedom of speech. You have no freedom of assembly. You have no freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. You have no due process, no equal protection of the law, or anything like that. In addition to which, in terms of across the broad society, when a corporation like General Motors or Microsoft speaks, when it is putting its billions of dollars into lobbying and into trying to propagandize on a particular idea, then the voices of human beings are drowned out. We cannot speak. And so when we have basically a corporate class through their institutions running this country, how can you have democracy? Mm-hmm. We don't.
I think that's an extremely important question. Going back to the central theme that Richard just spoke about, which was that people have inalienable and fundamental rights even before governments are formed. That's the crucial underpinnings of the American Revolution and the fundamental founding documents of this country, the good words that are in there. And we form governments to secure those rights. Wouldn't make any sense if we formed governments to deny our own rights. That is, in essence, what's happening. Because even though prohibited from doing that directly, governments are set up to secure rights, not deny them. When governments, including our courts, federal courts, state legislatures, Congress, when those entities confer rights onto corporations, which are basically the few running corporations, the corporate class, if we want to shorthand it that way, that when they confer rights onto that corporate class to deny the rights of the many, that is incompatible with this whole schematic of democratic control, because governments are doing indirectly what they're prohibited constitutionally within this framework from doing directly. And that's the key in saying that, do we have a democracy in this country? Well, we've never had one. And in fact, Richard's work going all the way back to the Nile and to other civilizations where we see that the few running the many, which is the structure that we have in this country now, is not unique to the United States. It's been perfected here, perhaps, some would say. But in essence, it goes back to 2,000 years, where the few have always sought the tools to govern the many. What we're seeing here is a perfection of that model.
And they're governing under what's called legal, through the law, and the culture is regarded as legal and acceptable. And I think sometimes it's helpful to look at some parallels to help to reveal what's going on. And that is, if you look at the slave system in this country, slavery was written into the Constitution and was legal, and Jim Crow laws, segregation. The same principle was at play there, that it was in fact the law that protected the slave masters, and it was the law that protected the segregators. And so it was the power of government, the power of state, the armed might of the nation that made that happen. And historian C. Van Woodward has a wonderful line saying, the majesty of the law was invoked into the hands of the conductor on the railroads. Because when the conductor came and said to an African American, you must sit in the back, in this special car, it wasn't just as a conductor for this corporation. It was that the corporation had in fact, and the whole slave class and ex-slave class had in fact imposed, driven those laws, that logic, that culture into the whole society. And we can see that now looking back at slavery. It's very hard in the midst of this corporate state now to see the extent to which that the law and the culture enable and support the few running these corporations to basically run this country.
I'd like to go with that for a minute and discuss perceptions. You've said that our minds are colonized. What did you mean by that?
Well, we live very much in a corporate culture, and it's been replicated now over generations. It's taught in the schools. It's taught in everyday life. I use the term default. That the corporate state and the corporate culture is the default. Anybody trying to do something different, heretical or blasphemous, has to work really hard. We have to choose different language. A good example of a default is if I want to have my telephone number unlisted, I have to pay more money. I have to do something extra in order to do that. Well, to get around the corporate default, if I want to, let's say I'm building a house, the default is most of the materials will be very toxic. A lot of use of chemicals. If I want to build a low-tox house, I have to make a huge effort to do something else. If I want to vote for somebody who does not believe in sort of the ideals and values that have been perpetuated over the last 100 years by the corporate state and by the slave state before it, for example, sort of that the source of all goodness is endless productivity growth, is maximum production of everything possible, mixed with world trade, mixed with the United States being the policeman to the world. That's sort of the basic value of this country, that coming out of the corporate culture. I rarely ever have a chance to vote for anybody who, in fact, doesn't believe that, who believes, believes in cooperation, who believes in that other species and the planet itself has rights, who believes that workers have rights, along the whole line. So that, and yet, every generation, most of the schools, most of the great institutions of this country, they're all, part of this. They support it, and if you want to, get a good job and rise up and all that, it's very hard to do that being blasphemous about the nature of the corporate state.
Can you say a little bit more about how corporations have sort of infiltrated the schools and the educational process? Well,
they do that in the educational system. There's some very tangible things, like for most universities, the corporations endow chairs, they give great grants. The School of Economics at one of the great public universities of the country, the University of California in Berkeley, the School of Economics is now the Haas School of Business. The Haas, the Levi Strauss family. That's happened. The drug companies, the chemical companies, the banking companies. They own their schools at Harvard and MIT, and the law school. They endow chairs for lawyers.
But isn't that benevolent?
Well, I'm sure the men and women who give the money think it's benevolent. But even if you have, for example, there is no law, to our knowledge, except for some people's law schools, Antioch Law School and one or two others. There is no law school which would teach anything of the kinds of things that Thomas and I are talking about here. There's no school of economics which would do that, or maybe very few. They keep our schools, even the public schools, public universities, keep churning out people who are replicating the values of the corporate state and the rules. Just the corporate advertising each year is $500 billion to $1 trillion, and it's not just advertising products; it's advertising a way of life, a way of thinking. I mean, and that's making it very hard to say we can in fact pursue liberty and justice and freedom by producing less. I mean, when did you ever see an educator or somebody heading up a major institution in this country talk about maybe we need to produce less? Who is talking about that mountains and rivers and streams should have constitutional rights? I mean, these are so far out beyond the pale that they're just not on the table. They're not rational.
In Pennsylvania a couple of years ago, we had the timber companies in timber-dependent communities who would write lesson plans for high school and grade school teachers about how great clear-cutting was. And it's bad enough, of course, that the money and the wherewithal and the resources are there to produce the lesson plans for the teachers and provide them with ready-made stuff dealing with clear-cutting. But lucky for the companies, they didn't have to just rely on their own resources. The Department of Environmental Protection, our own state regulatory agency, hops right in and has begun putting brochures together saying how great not only clear-cutting is, but also how great taking sewage sludge and applying it to land to grow crops, how wonderful that is. And that factory farms, these hog production facilities that have been driven into states like Pennsylvania, that those are advanced farms or modern farms. And so it's bad enough that you have the resources of the companies being used for those purposes. It's even worse that state power and control, when we talk about the corporate state, that's what we mean, that it automatically by default comes in behind those same actors, those few actors who are creating the culture for the majority.
To follow up a little bit, we could make a list that would go for pages and pages and pages of examples where the companies have written a lesson plan, or Walt Disney Company did a film, a number of films, My Friend the Atom, in order to be pushing nuclear power, with cartoon, with Mickey Mouse and Pluto and stuff like that. I mean, showing it to kids in grade school as part of their lessons. But there's another side of this, which is, looking at, that's the cultural side. The legal side, a good example is for 20 years now, at least, parents and communities across the country have been trying to get the junk food out of the school, in both machines and also in the cafeterias. And it's been a legal fight because the corporate traders corporations, the nonprofit corporations representing the junk food industry, or the food industry, whatever they want to call themselves, have been using the 14th Amendment, saying our equal protection rights are enabling us to call upon the law to prevent communities from passing laws to ban this food, this stuff in our schools. So it's not merely propaganda and education over and over again. It's that they're using, again, the clout of the state, the might of the state, this minority of people behind these corporations, to deny the will of a community, who say, we don't want this crap in our schools. And they cannot do that because the law stands in their way.
Let's change the topic a little bit and talk about protections and sort of what you're trying to do to deal with this problem. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your organizations and some of the successes you've had and some of the obstacles you've faced. And
okay, the Program on Corporations, Law and Democracy, POCLAD, was formed in 1993, basically by 9 to 10 other people like me, who in fact had been spending the previous 20 and 30 years sort of resisting the corporate onslaughts one struggle at a time. And folks started to talk about, it wasn't adding up. I mean, the struggles, the assaults seemed endless. And we began to talk about what is it we don't know about American history, about the past, about what we're doing that is preventing us from being more effective. And we started off by studying the corporation, and because the corporation is the dominant institution of our era, and for so long has been, it really opens up everything. It's like in 1830, if one had started to study slavery, the slave system in the United States, it would open up everything to the Constitution, the Founding Convention, what happened before, history, sociology, anthropology. It just opens it all up. And I can't say we've had a lot of successes in that our work has been to try to define what the work is. And how we need to reframe issues and how we need to structure our organizations and our goals and our strategies in different ways. Because even though people have been winning, even in my small group, a number of us had published many books. Some of us had been elected to public office. Some of us had been the president of union locals. Some of us had been involved in passing local, state, and federal laws that we thought were successful. And yet, all the indicators still, economic, political, ecological, the indicators seem to be still going bad, and the corporate class was concentrating its power more and more. Mm-hmm. So we've been basically trying to provoke conversations and get people to grapple with the history as we've been covering it, and also to begin to change what they were doing, and that's what sort of brings in the work of Tom.
We created the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund in 1995 to do something that we believed was very straightforward and very simple. It's gotten exceedingly complex over the past number of years. We began by providing free legal services to grassroots community organizations, mostly environmental groups, who were fighting a toxic waste incinerator or a new road coming in or a limestone quarry or all these different facilities and sightings that come in to different places year in, year out, mostly rural communities that we were dealing with. We were the permit folks. We would come in and represent community organizations to appeal regulatory permits. And we were quite successful throughout the early years. Got the awards and the funding and all those types of things that environmental groups look for. But increasingly we understood that we were doing a disservice to the folks that we were trying to help, because even though we would win this permit or overturn this or that, eventually the outcome was always the same, which was the corporation or the government agency would simply cite the facility and the permit would issue anyway. So we had short-term successes, but a lot of our work was about redefining what success meant. And working with POCLAD and with Richard, we finally began doing some of our work in a different way that used these single issues to give rise to some exceedingly fundamental questions about who should be making decisions about whether these things come into communities or not. Shouldn't there be veto power of sorts by people making decisions about investment and production, all those types of things that were inherent with siting decisions for facilities and other things coming into communities. And after doing that work in Pennsylvania for a while, then we partnered with Richard to put these democracy schools on. And the democracy schools are really taking the work that we've done in Pennsylvania and assisting people to replicate that work in other places across the United States.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. I sort of know the answer to this question, but what are our elected officials doing about this problem?
Well, elected officials are part of the legal and cultural framework of this country, where they are part of the problem. I mean, I would suspect in this country there's maybe a handful of elected officials who are even open to having the kind of conversation that we're having here and rethinking differently how they're going to operate. Maybe a few more on a local municipal level. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, elected officials come out of the corporate culture, and in terms of what their values are and how they think, where goodness comes from, where jobs and progress come from, it's certainly not from challenging the corporate state. It's by enabling the corporate state to continue to run over the people in the communities.
Well, Eliot Spitzer, who's Attorney General in New York, has been getting a lot of press lately as he's championed the cause of fighting against corporations and unethical behavior. What about that effort?
The work of Eliot Spitzer makes clear that the problem for us, from the perspective that we're coming from, is that we have to focus on what is legal more than we focus on what is illegal. And what Eliot Spitzer is doing, he's looking at corporate crime. He's looking at what the laws that the corporate state have put in, that the corporations have enabled and allowed, in order to sort of make the rules for corporate operation. When he finds a corporation breaking some rules for whatever, he'll go and find them. But nothing that Eliot Spitzer is doing is questioning the underpinnings of why does the corporate class within these corporations wield the Constitution against the rest of us. I mean, he's not opening up any of this other history, and the same thing happens after the Enron and all the other corporate so-called scandals. That people, the important people get very upset, or pretend to get very upset, and they pass some worthless law like the Sarbanes-Oxley bill, whatever, which is all about trying to fix some of the behaviors. but nothing about the underpinning, nothing in the arena of rights. And I think the most important thing that's coming out of the work that Thomas is doing is that they've reframed the name of the game in terms of civic work, and that the language is the language of rights and self-governance. And the targets, the goals, are about exercising our rights, our basic rights, our inalienable rights, and the rights to self-governance. And we're pushing it into the arenas. The arenas are the village square and the legislatures. They're not the regulatory agencies. They're not the courts, because those have all been long ago become monopolized by the corporations. So, in terms of rights and self-governance, you don't hear those words coming out of the mouth of Eliot Spitzer. Even though we've had some conversations with Eliot Spitzer, he's a very intelligent man. He heard us, he knows what this is. He's choosing to go his way, and he's going to ride it right to the governor's office.
So the underlying question to all this is, what does a people's movement look like that departs from the regulatory structure? I mean, what happens if the regulatory agencies gave a hearing and no one came? Well, we'd have the same result, but we'd have a lot of resources and energy that could be diverted someplace else to doing some real work. What does a movement look like that joins this majority together and refuses to be controlled by the minority or the corporate few anymore, which includes what the Sioux Indians used to refer to as the crawling people and the swimming people and the flying people and all the animals and the planet ecosystems and the earth? What does that look like when it doesn't rely on the courts or the regulatory agencies to try to help the movement along? What happens when a people's movement arises that understands that the courts and the regulatory agencies are going to do everything possible to stop the movement from arising? That's the question. What does that movement look like? That's what we find so exciting.
And you look back to the abolition movement and think about in the 1820s or so, when the abolitionists were really just crystallizing, coming together and trying to figure out what how they were going to talk about slavery, how they saw slavery, and what would be the goal. How come they didn't come up with the solution being a slave protection agency, like the equivalent of the Environmental Protection Agency? And that would have helped a lot of people's lives. It's because they took the time and the effort, like the populists 80 years later did, like the levelers and diggers in the 1650s did, to actually rethink what was going on, to start to challenge the traditional wisdom that they were being ordered to accept. And what they came up with was that slavery was fundamentally the government denying the fundamental rights of a huge number of people. And once you come to that conclusion, then your solution has to be in the constitutional and rights and self-governance realm.
I'm sorry to say that we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us here.
Our pleasure.
Thank you, Jeff.